Hey everybody. So now we're finally coming to learning about what is natural selection and how does it actually work. So the proper name of natural selection is it's the theory of evolution by natural selection. Because since it was developed, scientists have actually found out that there are some other methods that can cause evolution as well. So it's not the only process for evolution. And it's also important to think about the fact that it's a scientific theory. So remember that a theory in science, it's more complicated than just a hypothesis. It's a whole set of explanations that try to explain and describe a process that we see in nature. And when a theory becomes supported by so much evidence that scientists are essentially certain that it's true, it becomes an embedded theory. So the word theory in science is a lot different to the way we use it in everyday language. So when a theory has almost, and essentially it is complete support, and this is what's happened with the theory of natural selection, it's an embedded theory. Essentially, we know it's correct. So, natural selection, it's based on a whole lot of different observations made by Darwin and Wallace in the biology area and by Mendel in the genetics area. And all these observations they led to inferences. So remember, an inference is when we try to explain the observations that we see. So all these observations and inferences, they lead us to the overall theory of natural selection. So we'll go through how they all work. So the first observation is that all species, they make more offspring than the environment can support. And we can see this everywhere. We can see, here's a wattle tree with lots and lots of its little seed pods. And you can see how many seeds that one wattle plant makes. And if all these seeds grew up to be a wattle tree, the whole earth would just be taken over by wattle trees. And they'd spread out and take up every possible area they could. And it's the same with frogs and other animals too. And it's the same with every species. They make a lot more eggs and they have a lot more offspring than the environment can support. So you can see the frog spawn. It's had at least 200 eggs here. Nowhere near that will survive and reach adulthood. So the next observation is in the environment, there are limited resources. And so that means individuals have to compete for those resources to survive. So life is a constant struggle to survive. So we can see here, we've got some species of deer, and they're competing with each other. Two males are locking horns, and on the forest floor, seedlings that grow, they're always competing for light and nutrients as well. So these two observations, they lead us to the first inference. So species make a lot more offspring than the environment can support, and individuals, they have to compete with each other. So the inference we can make is that individuals have to struggle to survive, and only a small number will make it to an adult. So only a small fraction will actually make it to adulthood. And importantly, only a small fraction will reproduce, because that's how traits get passed on to the next generation. So out of this really cute, fluffy family of penguins, or there's a couple of families there, all these little young penguins, they're going to have to compete for resources as they grow up, and not all of them will survive, unfortunately. And this happens in every species. So the next two observations, these are the genetics-based observations that came from Mendel and other scientists. So observation 3, this one says that individuals in a species, they show variation. So there's some differences in their traits. Even though they're the same species, there are some differences. And we know this with humans. No two people are exactly the same. We look different, and our physiology works differently, and we have different skills and abilities. And it's the same with every species. So we've got tigers here. You can see variation in individual tigers. And here are some orchids too. So it's the same species, but there are some differences in the way the flowers look. The fourth observation is that traits are inherited from the parents to the offspring. And this might seem obvious now. We've done a whole unit on genetics, and that's pretty much the basis of genetics. But when scientists were first developing the theory of natural selection, this was a pretty novel idea, a new idea. So here's a picture of a mother when she was young and her daughter at the same age, and you can clearly see how similar they are. And we know this, that you inherit similar traits from your parents, so each generation those traits are being passed on. So out of those two observations, the next inference is that the individuals that are best suited to their environment, they're going to have a higher probability of surviving. So out of all the different individuals in a population, some will be better adapted to their environment than others. So individuals with traits best suited to their environment they have a higher probability of surviving and reproducing. So the key here is it's only talking about probabilities. It doesn't mean that every individual with the best trait will live and everyone will die who doesn't have that trait, but it just means you have a higher chance of surviving and having more children compared to other individuals in the population. So here's an example. In these little desert foxes, the foxes with the biggest ears, they can get rid of heat from their body a lot more efficiently with large ears. So the foxes in the population, the ones with the largest ears, they're going to survive best in the desert. And they'll have a higher chance of surviving and having more baby desert foxes. So the last inference, this one says that over time, if we think about the last one, if individuals with the best adaptations, so the traits that suit their environment, if they're surviving more and they're reproducing more, then those beneficial traits, they'll increase in the population over time. So over time, we can say that traits best suited to the environment will increase. And the opposite's also true. So the negative traits, those individuals will have fewer and fewer offspring, so the negative traits will reduce over time as well. So here's a couple of examples. If we go back to Lamarck's example with giraffes, remember Lamarck's theory was saying that if you use a trait more, then that will increase. So he thought that giraffes' necks grow over their lifetime, but in natural selection, which we know is the case now, it says that giraffes, out of the population, some giraffes will have slightly taller necks, and they're the ones that have a better chance of surviving and then reproducing. So then they'll pass on their taller neck traits to their offspring. And giraffes with smaller necks, over time, there'll be fewer and fewer smaller neck giraffes, and those traits will die off out of the population. Here's an example with some snails too. At the start, there are a few different colours of shell. We've got blue ones, green and red, as well as the normal brown. And over time, because the snails get eaten by this eagle predator, then the eagle can spot the red ones and the blue ones a lot easier. So the brown snails, they have a much higher chance of surviving and reproducing, and so over time more brown snails, or the brown trait, increases in the population. So they're the observations and the inferences. And so to put it all together, what actually happens to a population when natural selection is going on? So there's a few results. The first one is that over time, individuals become more adapted to their environment. So populations of animals and plants and fungi they become more adapted to wherever they're living. The next outcome is if an environment changes over time. So we know lots of things can happen to environments. There can be droughts and floods, or the climate can change over time. There can be new rivers made and new mountains made over millions of years as well. So if an environment changes, then natural selection will cause different traits to be favoured now. So if the environment changes, then natural selection, it's going to cause new adaptations to the environment. So here's an example. We've got some sort of wildflower here, and scientists have discovered that since the environment's changed because of human use, where we've turned the area into fields for farming, this plant now grows a lot smaller. You can see in the next picture. So the plants have been adapted to their new environment of their normal grassland being converted into farmland. The final outcome, and this is probably the most important one, is that if enough changes happen in a population over time, then that population can become a new species to other populations. And this is how, over the history of the Earth, more and more new species have evolved and come into being. So as natural selection happens, if enough changes occur, and a population can become a new species. So here's an example of mantids, which are an insect. So originally, these mantids would have had a common ancestor, probably back when the continents were all together in the supercontinent of Pangaea, because one of them is found in Malaysia now and one of them is found in Africa. But over time, when these two populations adapted to their environment, they've gained so many different traits that they're now two different species. So one of the species is a flower mantid, and you can see how well adapted it is to camouflaging on a flower. It's hidden just there. And the stick mantid, it's adapted to living and camouflaging as a stick. So it doesn't live on those bright orchids. It lives on these trees that have more bare branches. So over time, these two species have adapted due to natural selection, and now they're two different species. So they are all the principles of natural selection and what it actually causes.